background about the book. And before we do that, I'd like to offer a few suggestions about how we all might get the most out of this webinar series. The first thing, and perhaps the most obvious thing, is the book itself. Please do buy a copy of the book, have a copy, and more important than that even is to read it and to be conversant on what we'll be talking about this evening. It's only, and in the weeks ahead, it's only about 100 pages. And I do admit that it's 100 pages of rather dense material in some sections, but don't allow it to deter you. Yes, there are parts of it that I know people have said when I've asked them, have you read the Holy Science? And they've said, well, yes, but they started and they put it down, and that's not an unusual response because it is difficult in parts. It reminds me of a story that was told about Paramahansa Yogananda was speaking with one of the disciples, and the disciple mentioned how he had just read the Holy Science and he found it rather difficult. While listening to the conversation, there was a lady there who overheard the young man's remarks, and she said, oh, I read the book and I found it quite clear to understand. I understood it perfectly. And Master didn't say anything, Yogananda, Paramahansa Yogananda didn't say anything about that comment, but out of the earshot of that lady a little bit later, he said to the disciple, well, actually, I found sections of that book difficult to understand too. So in other words, giving him encouragement. And a suggestion that I have for proceeding with this book is as you read it, you'll notice that the first chapter called the Gospel is the difficult one. And I would suggest you skip that. Skip the Gospel right now and go on to the next chapter and read from there. We will come back and discuss that chapter, but I'm going to save that toward the end because I want to avoid one of the things that often happens when people pick up the Holy Science. They run into that first chapter and they put the book down because it is difficult, and admittedly so. So it's not germane to the main point of what the Holy Science is about. What the Holy Science is about is telling us how we can attain that which all souls are seeking, which is Sat Chit Ananda. And that first chapter is a background, you might say, of the evolution of consciousness, how this world came to be, how we found ourselves in this situation. But really, this deeper question that we have to ask ourselves is what do we do about that? How do we get out of it? How do we proceed forward? And that's where I find the Holy Science is a very practical book, and it's inspiring in that way because what he is describing is the one pathway to God. Oftentimes you hear people saying, oh, there's many paths to God. Well, yes, in outward expression that's true because cultures differ. Each individual, perhaps you could say, has their own individual pathway to God. But underneath, they're really, in terms of the evolution of the soul, that pathway which we must follow, there is only one. Paramahansa Yogananda said in his commentaries on in the Omar Khayyam's great work, that the pathway to God is through our very own nervous system. And this applies to us whether we are Indian, American, European, African, whatever it might be. We're all going to tread, and we must tread, that one pathway back to divinity. We have, you might say, descended from that high state of bliss, oneness with God, and find ourselves here in this world, and all of us, our soul nature impels us and calls us to retrace those steps back to the divine. And so consequently, we all are on this path. And this great book of Sri Yukteswar's describes the steps that are necessary for us to take. Now, what makes this book a bit dense is Swami Kriyananda, or Swami Sri Yukteswar, doesn't explain in depth of why or try to convince us or make the argument to coax us along this path. He just simply states the fact. This is the way it must be, and this is the way it is. And if you wish to make this journey, which all souls eventually are impelled by their very nature to undertake, some doing it quicker than others, some delaying that journey, then these are the steps that you will take, and that must be taken in order for you to achieve success. I'd like to begin by first reading a section out of the Autobiography of a Yogi where Swami Sri Yukteswar is requested by his Param Guru, Babaji, to write the Holy Science. And it gives a bit of background of why this book came to be, or how this book came to be. If you remember from reading the Autobiography of a Yogi, that in 1894, Swami Sri Yukteswar paid a visit to Allahabad to attend the Kumbh Mela. And there at the Kumbh Mela, he was wandering amongst the crowd of devotees there, and a sannyasi approached him and told him that he was requested, that a sadhu had requested his presence, and he went to him, and this turned out to be, which he discovered, to be Babaji. And Babaji asked him and requested him. He says, and Babaji speaking here, "I saw that you are interested in the West as well as the East." Babaji's face beamed with approval. "I felt the pangs of your heart, broad enough for all men, whether Oriental or Occidental. That is why I summoned you here. East and West must establish a golden middle path of activity and spirituality combined," he continued. "India has much to learn from the West in material development. In return, India can teach the universal methods by which the West will be able to base its religious beliefs on the unshakable foundations of yogic science." Sri Yukteswar says, "I deemed myself empowered by blessings of the saint and agreed to write the book. Feeling reluctantly that the parting hour had arrived, I rose from my leafy seat. Do you know, let me start again. At my request, Swamiji," this is Babaji speaking, "please undertake another task," the great master said. "Will you not write a short book on the underlying basic unity between the Christian and Hindu scriptures? Show by parallel references that the inspired sons of God have spoken the same truths, now obscured by men's sectarian differences." "Maharaj," I answered diffidently, "what a command! Shall I be able to fulfill it?" Babaji laughed softly. "My son, why do you doubt?" he said reassuringly. "Indeed, whose work is all this? And who is the doer of all actions? Whatever the Lord has made me say is bound to materialize as truth." And so he was commissioned, you might say, by Babaji to write that. And some months later, at the conclusion of his work, there's that delightful story in the Autobiography of a Yogi where Babaji had promised to come to Sri Yukteswar when he completed the book, and Babaji appears to him under that banyan tree on the banks of the river, the Ganges River there. And Sri Yukteswar is so excited to see him that he runs off to get sweets for Babaji, but then when he comes back, Babaji has disappeared. And if you don't know that story, you can find it in the Autobiography of a Yogi. It's quite nice. So Lahiri, or Swami Sri Yukteswar, writes the book. And with that, he begins, you might say, a mission of bringing Lahiri Mahashaya, his guru's teachings, out into the world. And he sets in motion forces that ultimately culminate in our guru, Paramahansa Yogananda, coming to the West and eventually fulfillment of that promise or that prediction of Babaji's, that the East and the West coming together, bringing together the scriptures of the Bhagavad-Gita and the Bible and showing the underlying unity of the two scriptures. Let's back up a moment though and look before that Kumbh Mela. Lahiri Mahashaya was Swami Shri Yukteswar's guru, and Swami Shri Yukteswar met him in about 1883 or 84. I think I've seen two different dates for that, but going back even further, Shri Yukteswar was born in 1855 in Serampore in Bengal, West Bengal now, and he grew up, and at an early age he lost his father, passed away, and his widowed mother raised him there, and he was a bright young man, very intelligent, had an interest in science. He grew up, went to school, eventually went to college, 2 years studying physiology, but then he dropped out of college, quit college. It had given him what he had sought, and then he took up his family's business and management of the properties that his family owned. And a short while later, he was married, and his wife gave birth to a daughter. But unfortunately, again, a few years later, after marriage, his wife passed away, and he found himself a widower. He raised his daughter, and when she became a marriageable age, she married and gave birth to a grandchild for Swami Shri Yukteswar, but then she too died. And so he found himself, you might say, without family ties. And meeting his guru in 1883, he becomes his disciple. And without obligations, he immediately plunges himself very deeply into the spiritual path and advances quite rapidly, ultimately becoming one of the greatest, if not the greatest, of Lahiri Mahashaya's disciples. And he begins to carry on the work of Lahiri Mahashaya, particularly after Lahiri Mahashaya's death, which was in 1895. He carries on that work of expounding upon the Bhagavad-Gita and the theories that he speaks of in the Holy Science. At that time in India, particularly in Bengal, there was a reawakening of spiritual consciousness in India. There was a great conglomeration of great saints were born in that part of the world at that time. And there was a reawakening, you might say, of spirituality in India in the late 19th century. One of the things that became noted for Lahiri Mahashaya, he was credited with reawakening the study of the Bhagavad-Gita. Now, before I had studied this a little bit, I had always assumed that the Bhagavad-Gita was commonly known even back centuries ago. And well, it was known, but it was not as popular, you might say, in the general consciousness of society in India as it is today. In those days, it was more a specialty understanding. And even reading, I read Mahatma Gandhi's autobiography, and he'd never himself even read the Bhagavad-Gita until he was in London, because it wasn't that well read. But Lahiri Mahashaya and, among other, the great saints, they began to popularize the Gita at that time. And also that was a time when there was a reawakening of spirituality in general in terms of yoga, Raja Yoga particularly, and if you remember, Swami Vivekananda came and Ramakrishna came at that time, and Vivekananda went to the West. And so there was this movement of these very high teachings out from India, particularly up in the area of Bengal. And of course, our gurus were part of that tradition, which flowered eventually in Paramahansa Yogananda eventually coming to the United States. And so here it is, many 150 years later, we carry on that tradition of that awakening of spirituality that took place in the late 19th century in northeastern India. So after Lahiri Mahashaya passes on, and after that events in the Kumbh Mela, Swami Shri Yukteswar continues to, after that time forward, very actively begin to write and teach in Serampore where he established his ashram. That was where he was born, in his family home. He turned it into an ashram. And in small numbers, he began to train disciples there. Ultimately, Paramahansa Yogananda, Mukunda Lal Ghosh, eventually became his disciple in 1910. But he begins to teach there. And one of the things he begins to expound, which is, you might say, one of the things he's noted for, and one of the things that he writes about in his introduction, is he begins to expound on a theory of the yugas that is quite commonly taught these days in the teachings of Paramahansa Yogananda and its tradition. And I'm not going to go into the theory of yugas in any depth in this series, because there are other class series that have covered that. And I would, again, recommend that you read this. And this theory, all of the, you might say, the classes in the series and the books that have written about the yugas and the theory of the yugas derive from what Sri Yukteswar says in his introduction. So do read that. But it forms the background against which this book is written. And in his description of the yugas, he makes some very pertinent points that are, you might say, the reasons why this book was written. In his theory of the yugas, what he is saying is that essentially mankind's consciousness and understanding of the nature of reality expands and diminishes in cycles of time. There are yugas that are, you might say, they're vast yugas of time, but he specifically addresses a cycle of 24,000 years during which consciousness rises and consciousness descends. Mankind's capacity to understand the nature of reality increases or diminishes, and that is the essential point behind his discussion of the yugas. Mankind's ability to comprehend the essential nature of this reality, and that in the diminished state, which is known as Kali Yuga, that mankind's ability to comprehend anything beyond this material universe, any reality deeper than that, is not present. That mankind thinks of this material world as the essential and only reality. And you see this expressed in modern day, where scientists will speak of consciousness as simply a function of brain activity, of material activity, rather than the other way around, which is what a spiritual person with spiritual understanding would say, that consciousness precedes matter. Matter is just a lower expression of consciousness. But mankind in Kali Yuga is bound to this idea that matter is the essential reality. Now, he goes on to explain that, fortunately, you might say for us, that we're no longer in Kali Yuga, that mankind has now moved out of Kali Yuga and is now in the second phase, the second Yuga, which is known as Dwapara Yuga. And this Dwapara Yuga, during it, mankind will begin to comprehend the nature of subtle energies that underlie matter. And we've seen, you can see in science today, we see that it's true. Over the last couple of 100 years, science itself has begun to understand there are subtler forces. Einstein, within 15 years after Sri Yukteswar writes his Yuga theory, expounds the E equals mc squared, the law of relativity. Quantum theory begins. You find that atomic energy begins to be a reality of understanding. Electricity itself flowers into all of the technological advances that we've seen in the last 100, 150 years. And so mankind's understanding that begins to question Might there be something, a deeper reality behind this material creation? And in Dwapara Yuga, man comes to the understanding that yes, there is something deeper than simply matter itself. And we begin to explore that. And that's where mankind finds itself right now. One of the questions in my mind, I've always wondered that he explains the qualities of or the characteristics of Kali Yuga, and Sri Yukteswar then goes on to explain the characteristics of Dwapara Yuga. And again, I reference you to the book to read more thoroughly about that. And I've always wondered, what is the characteristics of Treta Yuga, where it's the world of magnetism? And I thought, what are the characteristics of that? And I wanted to read a little quote that I found fun. And he says, the grasping power of human intellect is at present so limited that it would be quite useless to attempt to make the matter understood by the general public in reference to the attributes of Treta Yuga. And I thought, yes, but that's also a clue that he's not writing to an audience of Treta Yuga. He's writing to an audience right now which finds itself in that transition zone of coming out of a very materialistic time into a time of Dwapara Yuga in which we understand matter is simply a manifestation of energy. And ultimately, mankind will begin to discover that energy itself and matter are but expressions of thought, of consciousness. Now, he expounded these thoughts and he expounded this teaching, and it was not popularly received. He had quite a bit of opposition to this, but yet he said it as a background to the other teaching that he was also writing about, and this was the dissemination of the technique of Kriya Yoga. According to Sri Yukteswar, every age needs to have a sadhana routine that is appropriate for that time and for that age. And in Kali Yuga, the appropriate sadhana would be prayer, would be ritual, would be outward activities, ceremonies, such types of things, or you might say the devotional activities. They're outward outward activities to stimulate an upward movement of life force within the body. They're indirect, in other words. In Dwapara Yuga, he felt a new sadhana was necessary and appropriate for the age in which we are living. And for this, he recommended Kriya Yoga. And you could say our teachings and Paramahansa Yogananda, who followed Swami Sri Yukteswar, have said that Kriya Yoga is the technique for this age in which we live of Dwapara, because this is an age of energy. And rather than outwardly doing activities that have an indirect effect of raising our energy up in the body, up to the brain, we learn to be able to directly affect that through the practice of the Kriya techniques. And so he explained this Yuga theory as the background and the reasoning why in this age it was appropriate for Kriya to be now disseminated out into the world at large, because mankind's comprehension was able to understand the nature of subtle electricities, whereas a few hundred years ago, if these teachings had been offered at that time, it would have been impossible for that to be understood. But now it's not. We have evolved. Mankind very naturally evolves. He goes on to say that the one goal of all creatures is the attainment of that which is natural to it, deep buried within each soul. Each particle, you might say, of matter even, is this impulse toward experiencing of bliss, of Sat Chit Ananda. This is the one universal principle. All of us are trying to attain that, and at the same time to avoid the consequences of suffering which come upon us because of our inability, you might say, to comprehend that and our enmeshment within this world of matter. And this this universal principle is what drives all creatures ultimately to the spiritual path. Now, for those of you who are disciples of Paramahansa Yogananda, doesn't that sound exactly like what Master said in his very first book, The Science of Religion? That everybody is seeking happiness or trying to avoid suffering. And this was the message that Swami Sri Yukteswar is making in the Holy Science. And it forms the basis upon which then he goes further. And in his book, he's going to then, after expounding the goal, he's then going to move on to speaking about how. What is the procedure? If all of us as souls are looking for this Sat Chitananda within ourselves, how do we achieve it? And that's in his third chapter, which is called the procedure. So you have introduction, you have the first chapter, the gospel, which I'm suggesting you can skip over or read through real quickly, but we'll come back to it, fear not. And the next chapter is called the goal, which we're going to explain a little bit more next week. And the next chapter after that is called the procedure, which is, we're going to concentrate, that is the heart of the book, that chapter called the procedure. And finally, the chapter at the end called the revelation, which is those things that are experienced by once a person has accomplished the procedure and attained one's goal. What are the revelations? What are the results of that? And finally, the one short conclusion that he has. And so we're going to be step by step, we're going to be exploring each of those chapters. So again, I'm going to leave it at that for this first class, this first introduction. Invite you back next week where we'll dive into the book directly, starting with the goal that all of us are trying to achieve and the necessities for us to be able to achieve that goal. And I think this is going to be a fun adventure. It's a fun experience. I certainly am enjoying it, and I hope you will also. So until next week, and subsequent weeks after that, namaste, and I wish you well and many blessings to all of you.